Hello. Okay, we're going to start now. My name is Barbara Mellon. I'm the interim director of the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere. And I want to welcome you all to the inaugural lecture of the Mellon Award. The Mellon Award is called Intersections, Animating Conversations with the Humanities. And I would like first to invite Dean Richardson from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences to offer a welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. It's always a pleasure to be at the opening session of a Humanities Public Sphere series. And I'm very pleased this year to introduce a talk, which is the public opening of a Mellon grant, which Barbara will be telling you about in just a moment. So, Barbara asked me to say a few words about liberal arts and sciences, our college. And I just want to reframe, if I could, liberal arts and sciences in the following way. First, keep in mind that liberal arts and sciences is liberal arts and liberal sciences. In other words, the concept of liberal applies across the entire learning experience of a student in our college. And in our college, instead of using the usual humanities and social sciences and sciences splits, I like to say that we study nature, society, and humanity and the intersections among those. And that, I think, captures more about what our college is all about. You know, it turns out, as I think is going to be obvious here today and in the future, that it is the intersections where things that are very, very interesting happen in a college like ours, in our classrooms. The intersections between nature, science, and humanities. So let me give you an example from my field. Now, today Dr. Brophy is going to talk about the history, pre-Civil War history in the humanities. So I'll just take a pre-Civil War example from my field, chemistry, and tell you a little bit about it. So pure chemistry here, the 1800s, early 1800s, Dalton discovers the atomic theory of the elements. Great theory. Turns out that history has shown it to be absolutely correct. And that opened up a tremendous era of synthesis and isolation of compounds. And to just mark another time point, in 1823, Faraday liquefied chlorine gas into chlorine liquid. And now it became possible to transport chlorine anywhere in the world in a very compact way and make use of it. Pure science. That's all pure science. But now we get to the intersections with humanity. Chlorine gas. Well, it turns out in the 1800s, it was found out very quickly by the biologists that chlorine was an incredibly good disinfectant. And in fact, our drinking water ever since that time has often been purified by chlorine, saving many from terrible diseases. That's a great intersection. We all feel good about that. But then in 1915, chlorine gas was used to gas an army. And since then, it has been used purposefully to kill and murder civilians. And it has been released accidentally and killed civilians as recently as 2005 in Graniteville, South Carolina, when there was a train wreck of a chlorine car. It is the intersection where all of the things that we'll debate about chemistry come to pass. The environment, the environmental effects, the human effects in war. All of those things come out when we reach the intersections. And I think that we will find that in our college, our goal is to teach those intersections to our students. Our chemistry students need to know this. Our history students need to know these things. It is the intersections that we must pay attention to. I very much look forward to Dr. Brophy's talk. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, so when UF was invited to submit a grant proposal by the Mellon Foundation last academic year, the then director of the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere, Bonnie Efros, and associate director, Sophia Akert, who you've seen here, wondered how to assist humanities faculty members in articulating the significance of their cutting-edge humanities scholarship for the public and how to translate humanities scholarship for the undergraduate classroom to students across the curriculum. They also thought about how to help faculty members in the humanities and the great staff at UF in the libraries, the curators, the archivists, how to work together and how to connect them so that they can find each other and form groups to collaborate. They were also thinking about how to create networks and a framework that would allow to foster such relationships among humanities scholars and how to invite faculties from other departments and units outside the humanities to collaborate with humanities scholars. Finally, they thought about how to overcome the disciplinary divides and departmental silos on research, teaching, and public humanities. And they considered how to capture what students need to learn and what faculties could address in these kinds of collaborative groups. The Mellon Award that UF was invited to apply for and that was then provided to UF and that it is organized by the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere tries to do all these things. And it is a result of a year-long conversation. So this innovative program ties collaborative faculty research to the development of general education classes organized around grand challenges. And grand challenges are those kinds of questions that ask for an expansive academic answer, integrating multiple scholarly perspectives. These Intersections Awards will be given internally to 4 groups of faculty members for developing curricular and research answers to grand challenge questions that align with their teaching. These applications will be due to the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere in April 2018. And information will be forthcoming from our website in November. So we would like to invite faculty members who are interested in these grants to contact us, either contact me, Barbara Mennel, at mennel@ufl.edu, or contact Sophia Akert, or just come and visit us in the Center for the Humanities. But we also have a program that we would like to all faculty members and graduate students, if you're here, to participate, and those are organized around the Intersections program. And they include something called collabs, and we have flyers with the dates at the door. Those are collaborative labs where faculty members and graduate students meet. It's the form of speed dating for academics, where you find out what other faculty members and graduate students work on campus so that you can find connections for scholarship and research. As I said, you're invited to all of them. You do not have to apply for a grant to participate, and you can take these cards, and you can also contact us to find out more about this. And we have another talk about in this intersection series in February by Libby Roderick that will be about the pedagogy of difficult dialogues. That's also part of this whole grant. But coming to the talk for today, our esteemed guest, Alfred Brophy, we've invited him because we considered him an ideal interlocutor to address the grand challenge question of how to create a livable, just society for all in a place and time shaped by a history of racist assumptions and exclusions. His work, we believe, models the critical project of the humanities by tracing the fault lines of past humanities scholarship, institutional legacies, and antagonistic public debates organized around the question of slavery in the American South. After receiving his A.B. with summa cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania, a J.D. from Columbia University, and a Ph.D. from Harvard University, Alfred Brophy now holds the Paul and Charlene Jones Chair in Law at the University of Alabama. His research focuses on property, trusts and estates, and race in colonial, antebellum, and early 20th century America. Among his many sole-authored and co-authored books and law reviews articles, I would like to highlight just a couple. His latest, and which I have read and learned a lot from, because I don't know anything about these things, is University Court and Slave Pro-Slavery Thought in the Southern Academy and Judiciary and the Coming of the Civil War, published with Oxford University Press in 2016. Reparations Pro and Con from Oxford University Press in 2006, and Reconstructing the Dreamland, the Tulsa Riot of 1921, also from Oxford University Press in 2002. Currently, he's working on a manuscript about the idea of equality among African American intellectuals in the early 20th century, tentatively titled Reading the Great Constitutional Dream Book, The Black Origins of Brown. He's also co-editing a 1-volume on slavery and universities, forthcoming from the University of Georgia Press, and another on the writings of 17th century jurist Francis Daniel Pastorius, one of the first to protest slavery in the New World. And when he's not teaching, he's doing pro bono work, and we assume that he does not sleep. So before I step aside and hand over the floor to our esteemed guest, let me remind you to please sign in on the desk, which everybody did, I think, and I want to conclude with some expressions of gratitude. I do also have to tell you from Sophia Eckert that the hashtag for today is UF Intersections, and that afterwards there will be a reception outside. I would like to thank the former director of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere, Bonnie Efros, who created the foundation for the event of today. Also, the inspirational associate director, Sophia Eckert, who's over there hashtagging, and our hardworking program coordinator, Mary Collins. The event is made possible by the Mellon Foundation Award, Intersections, Animating Conversations in the Humanities. It was originally initiated by President Fox and assisted by Bester Farber, the Class Office of Advancement, the UF Foundation, the Class Research Office, and Class Shared Services. So please help me welcome Al Brophy. Thank you.
And so as we talk about the role of the humanities in colleges in American life, one theme I want to start with is how frequently the humanities are put to justifying injustice. And as a historian, I want to frame these field questions about the humanities, such as how literature, history, philosophy operate through the vehicle of talk about slavery at Southern universities before the Civil War. And there were, to be sure, some very promising beginnings. Jefferson's statement in the Declaration of Independence that all people are created equal was inspired by Enlightenment responses to monarchy. And though Jefferson may have largely abandoned these ideas as he moved from optimistic young person into pragmatic and maybe pessimistic old person in the 19th century, there's others picked up on this theme. So David Walker, a free person from North Carolina who fled to Massachusetts, wrote in his pamphlet, Appeal to the Colored People of the World. He appealed to universal ideas of freedom that came to, and this book came to stand for the ideas that the enslaved might free themselves. Walker's memorable phrase in urging opposition to slavery was that there is no more miserable person on the face of the planet than the slave of the United States. And in fact, some were taking action to free themselves. In August 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, Nat Turner and other rebels set off a rebellion that resulted in the deaths of dozens of white people and then dozens of slaves as the rebellion was violently put down. One rebel was killed on the road to the county seat, Jerusalem, and his head was put on a pole as a deterrent to other rebels. To this day, that road is known as Blackhead Signpost Road. And fear spread through the region. In neighboring North Carolina, slaves were tortured into confessions. Some were executed without trials. In Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, students petitioned the governor to give them guns. They didn't detect any spirit of rebellion, but they thought a show of force would prevent any further insurrection talk. And meanwhile, others turned to the technology of print to produce petitions that were sent to legislators throughout the South to ask for an end to slavery. But maybe that would be an end through violence. As with David Walker's appeal, the technology of print was harnessed to spread ideas of liberation. And then we have Quakers petitioning the Virginia legislature to ask for an end of slavery. And this brings up an important debate about slavery in the spring of 1832 in the Virginia legislature. When those from Western Virginia, you may recall that what is now West Virginia was, until the Civil War, part of Western Virginia. So representatives from Western Virginia, where the slave population was less than 10%, appealed to Enlightenment ideas of freedom and referred to the dangers of slave rebellion as they urged the Virginia legislature to take some action against slavery. And yet those ideas, those optimistic ideas that slavery should be ended, were put down by those who saw the value of property. They talk about the sacred principle of property doesn't derive its sanctions from conventional charters. Its foundation lies deep in principles of justice. It's the very ligament that binds society together. Without this principle, there is no civilization, no government. The ideas of property carried the day as those who defended the institution of slavery and beat down Enlightenment ideas of freedom said, they challenged slavery's opponents were with the indiscretion of children playing with torches and firebrands, regardless or forgetful that magazines are under and around us. And while there were some exciting proposals, Thomas Jefferson's grandson was in the Virginia legislature. He proposed a gradual abolition plan. The legislature votes down all of those plans, and they conclude that further discussion of end of slavery is inexpedient. And what emerges from that debate, then, is an important pro-slavery pamphlet produced by Thomas Dew, who was a history professor at William and Mary. And Dew's pamphlet surveys human history to make slavery look both naturally, so slavery's existed in more societies throughout human history than have not had it. And he pointed to the emancipation in Haiti to suggest that there would be demographic disaster if there were emancipation and murder of white people. He argued that colonization, which was the only thing that the white slave-owning community could contemplate, was economically infeasible. And he argued, in a sense, that slavery was good for white people because it made them all equal. These are the ideas that are being nurtured in places like William and Mary. And then he concludes in a sort of subtle and response to David Walker. He doesn't cite Walker, but Dew says, there is no merrier being on the face of the planet than the slave of the United States, right? It's a flip on what David Walker had said in Appeals to the Colored Citizens of the World. And I want to talk a little bit, though mostly what I'm interested in are the ways in which the wealthy and the well-educated are being told that what they're doing is right by the universities. I want to focus some on the ways in which universities themselves benefit directly from human connections. So let me turn to Washington College. You now know it as Washington and Lee University in the Shenandoah Valley. General Lee was the president of the college after the war, and so after he passed away, it was renamed Washington and Lee University. Washington College, before the war, owned more than 70 people who'd been left to them by a donor who died in 1825. And he left these people in his will with instructions that they not be sold for 50 years. And maybe he thought that in 50 years slavery would have ended. And in fact, if he had thought that in 1825 when he wrote his will, he was correct. And so what Washington College did was went ahead and it advertised, it rented out human beings. Here's a handbill that they were listing people for rent. And then they owned so many people that they turned to pre-printed forms to rent humans. And so the trustees of Washington College could just fill in the blanks of who they were renting, and here's a receipt, here's a contract for Millie and her child being rented for $15 for a year. But in the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion, Washington College found that they would rather sell their collection of, it was about at this point 80 people, and so they obtained an opinion letter from a lawyer that suggested the they could break that restraint of sale for 50 years. They go ahead and sell these humans, and they end up in Mississippi, where there's now efforts to try and track down the descendants that are turning up with some success. What they did with the money was built Robinson Hall, and this is a picture of Robinson Hall on Washington and Lee's campus to this day. But there's some other things that, pointing in other directions. Washington College also had a president who was opposed to slavery, who spoke openly against it, who argued about its economic inefficiency, and then he lost his job because of this. Because he was so adamantly anti-slavery, he was run out of town. This is unusual in the South at this time. What we hear more about are pro-slavery ideas at Southern schools. Neighboring Virginia Military Institute, which is adjacent to Washington College, was justified in part because of its role in training students to defend slavery. A required textbook at VMI was Thomas Dew's essay on slavery that was written by the William and Mary professor Thomas Dew. And you had speakers coming in from visiting dignitaries, lawyers, judges, representatives from Congress coming in to talk about how important slavery was. One in 1858 said at VMI that the landing in Virginia from a Dutch ship in 1820 has been in its results one of the most remarkable events in the history of mankind. Inconsiderable in itself, revolting as it may be to natural feeling, no calm observer of the progress of human affairs can fail to perceive in it the beginning of a mighty agency for the advancement of wealth, happiness, and civilization. These were ideas that were talked about and were common currency on college campuses, in part because of how people thought about history, how they thought about contemporary economics, how they thought about political theory. And so there was a political theory of hierarchy that said not everybody was destined for freedom. It turns Thomas Jefferson's statement that all people are created equal on its head and says some people are best suited for freedom and others best suited for slavery. And the students at Southern colleges soak up these ideas that they're hearing from visiting dignitaries and from their faculty. This is the Student Literary Society on the University of Georgia campus. And at many Southern schools, you'd have these literary societies that debated things like, is slavery expedient? At Washington College in 1851, students debated whether slavery should be abolished. 4-1, they said, no, it shouldn't. And then a few years later, they debated whether the institution of slavery is beneficial to the interests of the world, and concluded overwhelmingly that it is. Right? These are the ideas that are in circulation on campuses, that are promoted by faculty, that and that students bring both to the campus and then out into the world after they leave. Student literary magazines at University of Virginia celebrate a political theory of hierarchy. One article says that the great problem of the 19th century is slavery, which is an odd echo or presaging of what W.E. Du Bois says in The Souls of Black Folk, where he says the color line is the problem of the 20th century. And these articles in student literary magazines attack Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, turn slavery's history. They turn to slavery's history as a demonstration of the hierarchy that's inherent in nature and that not everybody is suited to freedom. And of course, they believe laws need to be followed. One article called Government a Divine Institution made the case for following human laws instead of abolitionist higher laws that would have allowed them to disobey the Fugitive Slave Act. What we see repeatedly are taking on these sort of timeless questions about the obligations we owe to unjust laws. And repeatedly, the response at the Southern University is, whatever the law is, you must follow it. So, students talk about history's lessons, which is that change is difficult and it will take centuries. In addition to their discussion of slavery's history, they look to other eras for lessons. They turn to the much maligned feudal era to suggest that it produced positive benefits for society, such as a respect for property, which was then used by English merchants to purchase freedom from the crown. The emergence of feudalism took centuries, just as the termination of slavery would, if slavery could ever be ended. This theory is that the change takes place at a glacial pace, that the law and constitution had to be calibrated to the people who governed it, that white people were fit for freedom, that those of African descent were not. Property and order needed to be respected or there would be violence and economic disaster. These ideas fit perfectly with the needs of Southern slave society. And we see these ideas being developed by faculty as well. University of Virginia law professor James Holcomb gives an 1858 address to the State Agricultural Society in Petersburg, where he asks, is slavery consistent with natural law? And what one would think out of the Declaration of Independence is that slavery, the one thing we know is that slavery is inconsistent with natural law. And yet Holcomb turns that on its head. He claims that the Anglo-Saxon race was entitled to freedom, that people of African descent were not, and might never be entitled to freedom. And history told that slavery was the natural condition. And then Holcomb goes from there to argue that law should protect slavery. And so by the late 1850s, you have cases in the Supreme Court like Dred Scott v. Sanford, and countless state cases restricting the rights of free people to sue for their freedom. All of this supported by and working in conjunction with these arguments that are being nurtured in the academy. Holcomb's final argument is that slavery is consistent with natural law. The North should not tolerate slavery and should stop trying to abolish it. And now I want to turn to the capstone of Southern pro-slavery thought. This is a treatise written by Thomas Cobb, who is a professor at what is now the University of Georgia Law School. And so Cobb has this 800-page treatise on slavery, and it's historical, and it's also contemporary. And he begins by, on the first page, linking history and philosophy to saying this is how we're going to understand law, what law is, what it should be. So he's deeply embedded in his version of history. And it is, that slavery is ubiquitous in human history, nearly ubiquitous in human history. And he turns to various sort of scientific explanations. He turns to the growing science of the growing literature on ancient Egypt. And he refers to books that refer to tomb inscriptions in ancient Egypt. There's undoubtedly somebody in this room who knows infinitely more about Egyptian tomb inscriptions than I do. I'm not making the point this is what actually happened, but this is how Cobb interpreted what was going on. So he looks to work on tomb inscriptions, and the claim is that these show things like sub-Saharan Africans bound together with rope, bound at the neck, and therefore enslaved. Then he turns to other work. Again, here you've got a sort of a scribe allegedly counting enslaved women from sub-Saharan Africa. These are the sorts of the evidence that Cobb is reaching out to suggest that slavery is ubiquitous in human history and that people of Africa, sub-Saharan African descent, are best suited for slavery. He has all sorts of other arguments. He looks at the emancipation in the West Indies. He looks at Haiti and then the emancipation in the West Indies to suggest that there will be demographic disaster, that the economy and the economic, that the economy in the West Indies went down, and it would be an economic disaster for the American South if slavery were terminated. All of these things, using every technique to say, we can't have change, any kind of change would be worse, invoking fear of what will happen, all sorts of pseudo-scientific studies about that supposedly show that enslaved people commit less crime than free people of African descent. And then the sort of trope that freedom would be worse for the enslaved, not just for the slave-owning class, but for the enslaved, because slavery is a patriarchal institution, and free workers would be treated worse. So here's one of the books he refers to, which is actually a sort of reform treatise called The White Slaves of England, becomes in Cobb's hands the argument that enslaved people would be worse off in freedom. He builds all of this together with sort of what he refers to as common law's cold legal reasoning. He says, disregard sentiments in favor of the enslaved. These are the things that are being, put forward by, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, Frederick Douglass is obviously, multiple interpretations of the Constitution as anti-slavery. He's responding, though not by name, but responds to these anti-slavery arguments of people like Stowe, Douglass, to a lesser extent, Emerson. And then we can think about sort of some of the humanist responses to this. Obviously, Herman Melville's post-war novella, Billy Budd, which critiques cold legal reasoning that just sort of takes considerations of economic efficiency into consideration, determining who should be a slave or who should be free. And Melville's Billy Budd, though it's framed around a sailor who was executed unjustly, we think is another illustration of the centrality of humanity, and how that should be humanity for the enslaved should be a central value, which is completely written out by the pro-slavery legal thinkers and pro-slavery academics. So Cobb takes these ideas of the naturalness of slavery, of the centrality to Southern society and economy of slavery, and a political theory of hierarchy. He takes these ideas to the Georgia legislature in December 1860 to argue for secession. And those of you who studied the Civil War know better than I do that what's critical in secession is that the to Southern secession is that Georgia leaves. South Carolina wants to leave all the time, but it's when Georgia decides to leave that the Southern independence movement really gets going. So we have Cobb as a central figure in the central state, leading us to Civil War. And then he was an engaged scholar. This is Cobb is a true believer. He goes, becomes first a colonel and then ultimately a general in the Confederate Army, and he dies on the battlefield at Fredericksburg, and then is buried back in Athens, Georgia, which is where he's from. What follows for Cobb, the war ended a little bit faster than for other people, but what follows the end of the war is termination of slavery, which, irony of ironies, Cobb's advocacy of secession brought about more quickly than if he had kept his mouth shut. And then there's a struggle to make a reality out of the Declaration of Independence dream of equality. African American, there's many pieces to the story, but African American intellectuals in the early 20th century begin to advocate in favor of the Equal Protection Clause, which I think of as a secular version of the Golden Rule, right? Treat other people as you would want to be treated. Everybody similarly situated should be treated equally. And that brings us to the sort of pinnacle of constitutional law in the 20th century, Brown v. Board of Education, and the modern civil rights movement. The dream of equality that was so central to American law was nurtured by people who were taking inspiration from things like the Enlightenment's Declaration of Independence. Now, that's the story I have about slavery in universities. Let me bring some of this together to ask some field questions for humanities in universities. And sort of, I think slavery in university talk can reveal how the humanities do not always point in one direction, as Dean Richardson's apt discussion of the sort of path, the sine curve of how chlorine was used over time illustrates in a different field. And so, this leads, I think, to a number of questions we should engage in, right? How have the humanities and scholarship more generally been contorted to serve the interests of the wealthy and the powerful? What are the ways for universities to resist the temptation to obey the interests of the wealthy? This may sound a little bit flippant to some of you, but I asked this question, I was like, why is it that we don't execute scholars anymore? And philosophers, right? This was done in the days of Socrates. Why is it that we don't do that anymore? Well, I guess to some extent we don't matter. And that may be a little bit more flippant, right? There are other reasons. We have a more tolerant state. We don't execute that many people. We try to make them irrelevant. And so that, I think, leads to this next question. Well, how can the humanities be more engaged? The practitioners of it, the students and faculty, can become more public advocates, right? Our president, I think, has given us a great model of how people can take to the public to advance their values, the values they believe in, hold dear. Think about this. Exxon advocates its values, so should humanists. Thinking and action are needed. Thinking and action are needed, right? Emerson says action is for the scholar subordinate, but it is essential. And then that brings me to sort of the questions outside of the academy. They're timeless questions for the humanities, right? Who's excluded from communities? How do we realize the timeless goals like the equal protection, equal treatment principle? Who has legitimate authority? What are the appropriate responses when people are denied a voice in their government? How is knowledge abused? How can ideas, literature, history, philosophy indict mindless formalism, like the following of the Fugitive Slave Act or pro-slavery statutes that people were ordered to obey regardless of the obvious inhumanity of them? How do we use literature, history, philosophy to indict hierarchy and to indict obedience? And then, in conclusion, to return to Emerson's American Scholar, how can we walk on our own feet, work with our own hands, and speak our own words, and remake the world? So I look forward to a lot of talk about all of these principles.
Okay, we open the floor. Okay, if nobody else...
We haven't said everything that could be said. We may have said everything that should be said, but...
I can ask a question that takes us far afield. So should I start? Can people bring it back? Can people remember? Okay, so I was on a fellowship in Germany last year at a university, and the place where I lived was actually a house that was owned by Jews during the Third Reich, who were taken away, and then the fascist police actually occupied the house. And then after the war, they were found in Switzerland, and they donated the house to the university for guests like me. And so
that's a great story.
Well, it's true.
It's a great story of how institutions are remade, a particular place, a particular spot to
And
remade.
so my question for you is with the story of the house that's built by the money that a university gets from selling slaves. What are your thoughts on how one deals with these legacies in buildings today?
I mean, I think that the best response to these legacies of slavery, or more, for many schools, Jim Crow, other kinds of, is to take the proceeds and turn them to a different purpose, right? I mean, I think about at my former institution, the University of North Carolina, it renamed a building that tragically and shockingly had been named for a person who had been a member of the leader of the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina right after the Civil War. Right, when we think about the Klan in the 1870s, were not the people we think of now, the sort of the jokers, the poorly educated, the marginal. They were the center of North Carolina society. And in around 1922, the Board of Trustees at UNC named the building for that man, William Saunders, and it said, in the Board of Trustee minutes, it said, accomplishments, literally, or, colonel in the Civil War, and it did some other things. Leader of the Klan. That included his accomplishments. So, obviously, at that point, you have to rename the building. Although I'm generally against renaming, but at that point, you have to rename the building. And also, I thought what the great thing is that building is now being used for promulgation of ideas, liberating the next generation. And I think what we should be doing is thinking about why it is that we had why did somebody name a building after this person in 1920, and think that was an accomplishment. And I think that's the sort of, for me as a historian, right, always what we want to do is use these moments as teaching devices, and rather than sort of ignoring an unpleasant past, using it for understanding who were we as a university before, and who are we going to be going forward.
Okay. Yes, Mitch. Oops, sorry. I can't remember. Oh, sorry.
So your talk was, I think, completely limited to the South.
Yeah.
But does that mean that the North is not, or was not complicit in this, or do you have examples from the North?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. So in part, I think I was focused on the South because we're in the South. But this is some many things one could talk about about northern schools. One example that I find super interesting is Barnard College, right? Sort of distinguished women's college in New York City that was started right after the Civil War by the president of Columbia University, Frederick Barnard. Before the war, he was a professor at first at the University of Alabama and then at Ole Miss. And when he was at Ole Miss, one of his students, the enslaved women he owned was assaulted by a student, and he kicked the student out of school. And then that student was so enraged that he then got the trustees to try Barnard for having taken the testimony of a slave against a student, a slave against a white person. And so he comes in and is like, look, I understand I'm from the North, but I'm as much in favor of slavery as the next guy. And there's tragically some evidence that when essentially the same thing or worse, if such a thing you may imagine, happened to some of his enslaved humans when he was on the University of Alabama faculty. So then after the war, he goes north, war starts, Barnard goes north, and then he ends up as president of Columbia University. So I think it shows you how deeply intertwined American institutions are with slavery. That Distinguished Women's College in New York City is named after somebody whose slaves were being assaulted. Slave owner, slaves being assaulted. You always wonder about how much complicity he had in that, or what more he could have done. That just happens to be one example. I've done a bunch of research on, but there are many other examples. I think somewhat unfortunately, when Harvard has been talking about their relationship with slavery, they have been emphasizing how many anti-slavery advocates they produce, right? So Emerson, Thoreau, Theodore Parker, many other people. That seems to me is like the sort of thing you want other people to say rather than sort of going out of your way to talk about how great. They benefited from the institution of slavery, from donors. Louis Agassiz obviously was deeply embedded in this racist science. This is a talk you could replicate in using different data points for many other places. And I think the universities, completely understandably, are very vulnerable to the interests of the wealthy and well-educated.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. You were speaking about the renaming of the building for the KKK leader.
Yeah.
Could you speak your opinion on the monuments, how you feel about that?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I am generally, I think, against renaming of monuments because I think I think taking down a monument facilitates forgetting. I think what we should do is preserve those monuments largely so that people will be questioning, like, why is it that there was a big statue of Robert E. Lee in the middle of the nicest street in Richmond, Virginia, and that was put up in 1890. I actually think the monuments invite further discussion. I think taking them down is a sort of yes/no decision. Obviously, this should be decided by the local community. I mean, I think that if the local community decides this is a sore that we don't want to live literally in the shadow of sort of images of heroes of the war to maintain slavery, they certainly should have the right to take that down, though there are many southern states that have legislatures that refuse, that have statutes that prohibit taking down monuments. And I feel somewhat differently about the Charlottesville Robert E. Lee statue, because it's almost like that has become a sort of rallying point now, right? The way I would distinguish many Confederate monuments from the Saddam Hussein monument that was taken down in Baghdad in whenever that was, 2003 was that? or the statue of King George III that Americans pulled down in New York in 1776. Those were parts of contemporary ongoing political moments. And it may be that the Charlottesville Robert E. Lee statute has also become part of that. It's so complex. It's such a complex story. For me, what is most important is the sort of education about what was going on in the past, how particularly the universities are connected up to that, and then what implication that has for the present. Right? So why is it that a third of African American children live in poverty? I think, and 10% of non-Hispanic white children live in poverty. I think we could all agree any children living in poverty is too many, but what accounts for that incredible chasm? Well, I think it has something to do with the era of Jim Crow, maybe to a lesser extent slavery.
So I have two hands already,
Okay.
one there and then Trish.
Yes, just on the point you just made about monuments, how I'm teaching a class right now on being and blackness, and I find out of the 18 students, 16 of whom are white, the 2 students will understand the kind of trauma that comes with the Robert E. Lee statue, and then the 16 other students are so blasé. So how do you suggest leaving the monuments and not changing names and things like that, and then creating a way to have that education happen every day? Because for the majority white population, they don't care.
They don't care. Yeah.
About
No, and I think a lot of these are people are oblivious to the sort of monuments. There's a granite monument in front of the University of Alabama's library that I think it's 2 Confederate soldiers, but there's no it's just a granite block. I think most people on that campus have no idea what that is. Yeah. So I think there's sort of 2 ways of thinking about this. Obviously, there needs to be contextualization. I wouldn't say you leave a monument up with no contextualization. I mean, I think this is exactly what we need is contextualization. In the statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond to Jefferson Davis, I think has literally no mention of slavery. He was a constitutionalist, and I'm sorry. I mean, that is exactly, I think, what we need. And counter monuments. I mean, it's like maybe Nat Turner should be, or Frederick Douglass should be, on a pedestal just as high, facing him on the other side of the median. Along those lines, I think Talbot County, Maryland, did a great contextualization. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, is from Talbot County, Maryland, and they put up, around 2011, they put up a statue of Frederick Douglass opposite the obelisk to the Talbot County boys who were the Confederate soldiers from Talbot County. I think that's great. You get a conversation going. I mean, as to try and how can we have other folks see through our eyes, right? Let me give you one example. It was some years ago, I was representing a pro bono client in a little rural county, middle of nowhere, North Carolina. And always what you want to do when you're talking to clients is beat down expectations, right? Even if in your own mind you're like, hey, we're going to win this one. You want to beat down their expectations. This is explaining all the things that why we might not be successful the next day in this hearing. And I said, but you tell me, what do you think? I've never been in this courthouse before. I don't know any of the players. What's it going to be like? She goes, Al, there's a Confederate monument out front, so we're going to lose. And I thought, wow. That I would see that is because I'm obsessed with issues of monuments and race and sort of, but that she would say and that one moment flipped how I thought about Confederate monuments. I mean, I don't think they should be in front of courthouses, the place that we send people for justice, and telling individuals that you are not going to get fair treatment. So I don't know, maybe that like a vignette like that. And it's like, how would you think, student, if there were, if you were in the shoes of that individual going to seek justice, and you have to walk by the. It turns out the hearing didn't go as well as I thought we were going to win. I mean, in my own mind, I was like, yeah, we can. And it turned out it didn't go. We're walking out of the courthouse, and she's like, I told you we were going to lose. I'm like, yeah, it's far from over. Don't worry. This is just the first year. I thought we were going to walk out of victorious. That it's far from over. Okay.
Okay, I think Trish was the next.
Thanks for talking through the monuments issue. I think the idea that huge swaths of the American population don't actually think much about them.
Sure.
Of the white American population, at least, don't think much about Confederate monuments is a really good point that's often missing from the dialogue. I know that I can say with 100% assurance that I used to go to Lee Park in Dallas when I was growing up, and I like to sit on the horse statue behind Robert E. Lee because it was a great place to drink beer and look out at the park. So I had no consciousness of what that was, and I was an intelligent, thoughtful, rather political teenager. And I think contextualization is a way to raise that consciousness and create the spark of conversation that you're talking about is so important. So, but that's not my question.
It's a good observation. Right.
The question is related because you've talked about the way these historical documents make clear the degree to which universities in the North, as well as in the South, were complicit in the slave trade and benefited from the exploitation of humans for centuries. That's an important point to make. Consciousness needs to be raised about that. Universities need to reckon with it. Students and faculty need to think about what their position in the university means and how it's related to that history. So, is that the end game, consciousness raising? Or is there more action that needs to follow from that? For example, like Georgetown's decision last year to take the funds that they had realized with interest accrued over time from the sale of those people. Is there action that is necessary and right once consciousness is raised? Or is that too contextual? The community, the university needs to decide what to do, or are we all...
Yeah, it's super, what's the end point in all of this, right? So one of the nice things that makes this an easy, in some ways, a very important question, hard to answer in other ways easy to answer, is like, we're so far from the point where we have adequately contextualized and understood the relationship of the powerful, the wealthy and well-educated to the university. And presumably and importantly, we could interrogate how today the universities are the dependent variables that are controlled in important ways by the wealthy and well-educated. So I think there's discussions to be had entirely outside of the context of slavery, probably entirely outside of the context of race as well. I think this is just one example. We're very far from thinking about what the next steps would be beyond memorialization and additional contextualization. But I will hazard one statement that I think the response to the university should be sort of along the lines of the harm. So one of the things that the universities were doing was talking about the way in which slavery was natural and emboldening people to then take to the battlefield to support the institution of slavery. And I think the response should be in some ways related to the knowledge that universities created. We're in the business of knowledge creation and dissemination. I think our responses should be largely along those lines. Whereas, when we find out that J.P. Morgan Chase's ancestors in banking in the 19th century, before the Civil War, owned literally thousands of human beings. They held mortgages on them. I thought that the response should have been, in addition to sort of apology and acknowledgement of this, something that was related to where J.P. Morgan Chase's expertise is, which is finance. These are all questions that we need to explore, and we've got a lot of time to figure out what the next steps look like.
I have two on the list, so you're first, okay. Yeah? Yeah, yep, yes. Yep.
Yeah, I would like to challenge the idea that there are moral values here that can be honestly and authentically recognized by your idea of contextualization of statutes. And I think there's something wrong with that because I think that Black Lives Matter. And I think that is not being acknowledged in what you're saying. And I think you should ask, what does it mean to African Americans that these are in their face and part of the history that is acknowledged as, oh, well, let's contextualize it, and then white people and black people can talk about it. I don't think that's the answer to this question. I think the answer to this question is to get rid of it because it's an offense to everybody who is African American, and it's very clear that it is. And taking it down says it's over as far as that is concerned.
Those are really important sentiments, and though I don't quite agree with you on certainly the amplitude or all of the calculus that you undertake, I think that that's a very fair statement. And as I've said, I think this is a decision that should be made by the local governments. So this is the decision that New Orleans made. I think it's probably a mistake to take them down, largely because they will facilitate forgetting. And the next step will be we've solved. The next response will be we've solved that problem. We've solved the problem of racism, and it will be easy to forget that the era of Jim Crow and slavery ever existed. But I understand that other people view those calculations differently, and in 10 or 15 years we'll have a good idea of which of those policies made the more sense. Yeah, I think that's fair.
I was fascinated by your comment that scholars are especially vulnerable to rich people. It seems like we're approaching an age where every billionaire and every industry will have its own think tank. And I guess those think tanks are largely made up of scholars who were brought in, I guess, sometimes. So it's sort of like we're repeating those.
Yeah. A very good way to get lots of grant money is to tell rich people that whatever they're doing is right. Right? I mean, it's just like New York Times did a really interesting article, or it was the Wall Street Journal, did a really interesting article on Google's financing of law professors. I'm like, I knew all of them. It's like, that's funny. I know all these people, and they're very reasonable individuals. But and then the question became, to what extent are they bending scholarship? It's not inherently bad. But I think we need to be attuned to the ways in which people's self-interest bends the answers that they give.
A few days ago, we had a talk on the Anthropocene, and one side of it was that, the Anthropocene means that we're now wrecking the planet. But then it turns out there was a group of scholars who were financed largely by the, various industries, the energy industry and pharmaceutical, who say the Anthropocene is just a new golden age. It's just the coolest thing that could have happened to this planet. So it was just another example of how you can always find somebody to argue your point.
The tobacco litigation is a great example of that, right? There are many examples that a number of you will know infinitely more about than I do, because my specialty is the 19th and 20th century race. I think that's the challenge of the academy, right? And this is what Emerson is saying. This is like, don't allow self-interest to bend you away from what appears to be the right decision. And that's what we want to do. This is what the humanities invite. Is somebody saying, let me ask a series of questions, and the answer may be less important than the journey of asking those questions.
There's a young woman over there, and then I suppose
Can you talk a bit more about the idea that slavery was consistent to natural law, and about how at the time the law enforced that, and how people could have reacted against the law but didn't?
Sure, thank you. That is, I'd love. Okay, so the question I think is sort of three parts. What's the argument that slavery is consistent with natural law? How could people? How was that? Why was that influential? And how could people have rebutted that? Right. So the idea that slavery is consistent with natural law, incredibly inconsistent with what we think of from the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal. That seems to be, if you have a principle like that, then you think that's our natural law principle. Nobody should be enslaved by another person. So what these Southerners did was they looked to history as a sort of guide to what seemed to be natural, inherent in human society. They see slavery in many different institutions, many different cultures, and instead of saying, gee, that's something we're working our way away from on the progress of civilization, like, no, that tells us history is a sort of guide that tells us what is natural, what is correct. And then they have all these sorts of economic and arguments about how important slavery is to Southern society, and again, that's what makes it look natural. And so then that's their argument, that it's not some kind of dream of Jefferson and other optimistic Enlightenment thinkers. It's what is pragmatic tells us what natural law is. That's point one. Point two is, how does this then get interpreted by judges? And then they take these arguments and say, well, slavery is ubiquitous. That means when a free person, when a slave goes into free territory, there's like a bubble of slave law that goes with them, which is why Lincoln and other people, anti-slavery people, feared that the next sort of step would be the nationalization of slavery, because wherever the enslaved person goes, there's this bubble of natural law that follows them around, making slavery national. And the flip side from the Southerners' perspective is, and that tells them that their property should be respected wherever they go, to Massachusetts or New York, Wisconsin. How could people have responded to this? And I think that's the great question that we see, and this is what motivates Emerson and Thoreau, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass. I mean, the great abolitionists respond to things like the Fugitive Slave Act that said, if somebody is a fugitive from slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line and the slave owner shows up, the only defense you can have is that the person they've captured and says belongs to them is not the person they've identified. So they capture Alfred, and all Alfred can say is, I'm not actually Alfred. I can't have any defenses like I was freed or I was never enslaved. And so this Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 reaches north of the Mason-Dixon line, is incredibly offensive to anti-slavery people. And that's what leads a lot of people to say, well, this is a law, I didn't have a say in it, I shouldn't have to abide it. And that's one of the great sort of conflict points, where you have Southerners who say, no, my property right must be respected, and you can't have any, you have to follow the law as it was passed by Congress and the state legislatures. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great, that's one of the great questions of obedience to unjust laws, right? And it comes up in the Vietnam era, and I think we're going to probably continue to see that, resonances of that, and probably going to see it again, increasingly.
Thank you. Can you say a little more, Professor Brophy, about the emergence of anti-racist and anti-slavery thought in the academy? I'm curious what that looked like. Was that literature professors reading Harriet Beecher Stowe in their classes, collaborating with philosophers, historians, unearthing more correct forms of evidence?
Yeah, no, it's a super interesting question. Tragically, I think many of the people, the great leaders of the anti-slavery intellectual leaders, are people outside of the academy. So Stowe, one of the things that she does is incredibly critical of people in the academy, in churches, sort of the people in power, obviously lawyers and judges. Emerson has a great statement. It's just something like, in the wake of the rendition of Anthony Burns in 1854, Back to Slavery in Virginia from Boston, he says something like, all of the powers are aligned against this one poor slave. It's the pulpit, the learning of the academy, the commercial interests, all of them lined up in favor of the institution of slavery. There are some people south of the Mason-Dixon line who are anti-slavery and have the temerity to speak out. A lot of times that will be in the most sort of terms that are most acceptable to Southerners, which is talk of colonization. So there'll be a lot of talk of colonization, and that it covers some incredibly racist people who just want to have people of African descent removed from the United States, up to people who are end up life zealously anti-slavery, but that is the only terms in which they can speak in the South. James Burney, who runs for president of the Liberty Party, is 1854, starts off life as a colonizationist. Within the academy, there are a few. There's a professor, there's an engineering professor at UVA who takes on, sort of lifts up the mantle of Jefferson, talks about the importance of the Declaration of Independence, all people are created equal, and takes on specifically people like James Holcomb, these UVA professors who are talking about hierarchy. And then north of the Mason-Dixon line, you'll get people, Oberlin obviously is one of the great sort of anti-slavery bastions. And a lot of that is a lot of these terms are religious thought. Also, Brown University's president, Francis Wayland, writes a very well widely adopted moral philosophy text. It's used in many Southern schools, but he argues about the sinfulness of slavery. Yeah. Anyway, well, thank you. Okay, you'll run anchor.
Okay. Last one. Yeah. So your talk is literally about what I'm working on my dissertation right now, and the paragraphs that I wrote today are essentially about what you're working on.
I'm glad we're working on the same wavelength. Yeah, it's good.
We can talk later, but I'm working on this, a nephew of Napoleon who wrote pro-slavery books in the 1830s. And his goal was his efforts were reforming efforts. He was trying to basically tell Europeans, look how much of a great idea slavery is. So those were his intentions. They were reforming efforts. He was not a professor, so yeah. I'm wondering the people that you're talking about that do. Yeah. His efforts were reactionary, I guess. He wrote this essay that you're talking about after the debates in the Western Virginia legislature.
Yeah.
So what about, I'm wondering, because I was thinking about this today, why did he write this? Because we're talking about the early 1830s when, slavery was safe. The big emancipationist, abolitionist wave was not going to happen.
It was still in the future.
Exactly,
right?
it was still in the future. So why do they write? Is it purely reactionary, or is it just an intellectual exercise?
I think I think is responding to the debates, right? And the conservative side, the pro-slavery side won, but I think he wants to sort of build police the borders of anti-slavery thought, and wants to stamp out as like you can't have colonization, you can't even have gradual plan, and he's largely successful, tragically, in that argument. It's like after Dew. These Southerners say, is like Dew settled the argument for them that slavery was the led to civilization. At some point I want to hear about like how slavery becomes part of the reform movement, but that's it's easy, I think, for the wealthy and well-educated to be told that what they're doing is right. That's a great example of this. Anyway, so thank you so much. Thank you.